So welcome back everybody. I'm here with Dr. Martin Feeley, who was the clinical director of the Dublin Midlands Hospital Group and a very esteemed and experienced doctor. And then last year, after you spoke out against the lockdown and you said that you didn't think that it was a good policy, you were effectively sacked by the HSE. I think you'd agree. I wonder if you'd want to kind of introduce yourself and talk a little bit about that just for the benefit of our audience.
You're correct in most of what you're saying. Sacked, I actually resigned. That's the reality of it rather than being sacked. It might amount to the same thing, but I resigned. And yes, I did get into hot water when I took issue with the policy of lockdowns. It didn't make sense to me at that time, and I thought I actually was innocent enough to think that if I spoke out, it would start a debate and other people would get involved and maybe people would see sense. As it transpired, sadly, we know that didn't happen.
Absolutely. And they told you your position was untenable, which, I mean, I think most people would take as code for...
Yeah, effectively, I was asked to retract or withdraw what I said, which was quite a stupid thing to say to me. I'm not going to do that no matter what. Or else, as you say, my position is untenable.
Absolutely. So obviously when things like that are happening, I mean, you're not exactly a person who is unexperienced in the area of medicine. You know what you're talking about. And in a normal society, you would expect an opinion like that, even if you disagree with it, to be facilitated and, as you say, spark a debate. What do you think it says about the culture of medicine or government policy in this country that you can't even question something as dramatic as a lockdown without being pressured the way you were?
Unfortunately, it says mostly bad about the culture and that someone can't speak out and speak their mind. The least you'd expect is someone to come back and challenge you, yes, rather than just say, that's not for discussion. So that's a bad start. I have to speak for the medics. Like, people repeatedly say to me, why don't the doctors speak out? Well, as you've correctly alluded to, a few did speak out and suffered, and it's getting worse from day to day. Like, most recently, doctors have been taken off the medical register, taken away from their livelihood, banned from working, because they stated that they were concerned about the vaccines. And yet 2 or 3 weeks later, the entire vaccine program was almost pulled because of concerns. So the doctors who had this just from their own scientific thinking get fired. It's utterly ridiculous, but it's, apart from being ridiculous, it's extremely worrying. It's like, it says an awful lot about where we are as a culture or as a country. But the most bizarre thing, Ben, is that this is not just Ireland. This is happening everywhere. And that to me is something I can't fathom.
Because, you think about a medical expert and you want somebody to be as impartial and as clear-headed as possible when they are giving you their assessment of how we should combat a virus. And so if you think, I mean, obviously doctors and scientists are just people like anybody else, and they have concerns about their career and their future. And so it's almost like we've created a situation for ourselves where we're guaranteeing we're not going to get the best information because people are too afraid to tell the truth, even if they think they found it,
I think there are 2 points, Ben, about that. One is the one we've just alluded to, that is that people are afraid to speak out because if your career is terminated, then that's obviously a huge price to pay. But the other one is that the people at the coalface, the people working in intensive cares, nurses and doctors, like, they're so immersed in what they're trying to do. In their heads, they're thinking that the people driving this know what they're doing, so I'll just do my job. So they're actually too busy and too immersed in what they're doing to think about the big picture. And for me, that's an important factor, because people ask, why aren't they speaking out? And that's the reason.
So dissent is not allowed, as we've discussed. But one of the most interesting things about that to me is the fact that the government and the HSE and even the World Health Organization and groups like this, their position on many of these issues has actually changed over time, as you know yourself. As recently as this time last year, it was the official position of the World Health Organization and even our own health service that masks for people who weren't sick didn't work and that they didn't recommend them. And now that they've changed their mind on that, and if you were to go against that, if today you said, you know, I don't believe in the effectiveness of masks, the media would have you believe you're some kind of lunatic crackpot for believing what the experts believed not 12 months ago, you know? So it seems like it's a weird changing picture of the world that we're all just supposed to adopt uncritically, and if you have the slightest bit of doubt, you are written off as, you know, fringe or something like this. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose one of another mystery to me is that despite the fact that the Dublin Health Organization, the scientists, NEFID and government have made more U-turns than would make Charlie Hive blush, the people still accept what they're being told. This is, to me, astonishing. The list of no science, Ben, is unbelievable. There is no science for publicly wearing masks. The only worthwhile study was done involved 6,000 people in Denmark, which showed that there was no significant benefit from wearing masks. Full stop, end of story. It may seem a contradiction, but my first crossing of swords with NEFID was when I wrote to them middle of March last year and said that our frontline workers should be wearing masks in the hospital. And by that I mean nurses and doctors, particularly in ICU, and all frontline workers, even in the ED department. The two large hospitals that I was involved with, we endorsed and supported them in wearing masks. And we got into some degree of difficulty because I was told this was rubbish and the main thing was hand washing and there was no role for masks. And as you've rightly said, within a few weeks it's mandated that masks for everybody in hospital, and then a few weeks later it's masks on the bus. So that's just one aspect of the science or non-science. There is no science for 2 meters over 1 meter over 3 meters. There actually is no science for that. There is no science for masks. As I said in the article, the World Health Organization 2 months before the outbreak of this pandemic said there was no place for isolating close contacts in their homes. They said there was no evidence for or against changing workplace practices or closing down workplaces. And yet here we are with lockdowns implemented, rolling lockdowns. So my article, I keep going back to science and looking for science. Now, when there's no science, we had knee-jerk reactions. But when we've had in Ireland, there's a whole series of knee-jerk reactions. And any science that comes forward is ignored. So this follow the science thing is quite irritating because the bit of science that is there isn't being followed.
I mean, one of the things I found most astonishing was there was that case just recently where we obviously have the mandatory hotel quarantine system, which has been a catastrophe, most people agree. And there was a man who was fully vaccinated coming from Israel, and he was coming to see his dying father, and he was kept in quarantine. And he said, like, what is this? I'm vaccinated. I'm not a carrier of the disease. And then after a legal challenge and a review, they allowed him to leave quarantine. And then after that, they said, nobody coming from Israel has to quarantine. We're going to take that country off the list entirely. And you think, this is the way we're making decisions? One case, and suddenly we lift the ban for the entire country. It shows how kind of arbitrary and, as you say, knee-jerk the whole thing is.
I think knee-jerk is what it is, because common sense would say that that person shouldn't have been quarantined. Neither should many others who have been quarantined. And that's just assuming there is a role for hotel quarantining. There is absolutely none. There is zero science to support the quarantine program. zero. There's no doubt in my mind, but it's been driven by the Zero COVID Brigade, who have no science whatsoever. But the man who masterminded the eradication of smallpox said there are a number of criteria that need to be fulfilled if you're thinking you can eradicate a disease. And two major ones are, one, you need to be able to detect and diagnose every case, and that is absolutely not the situation with COVID-19. So we're gone at strike one. The second is there must be no environmental replication or outside the human host replication of the virus. And that's not true with this, because this is carried by animals and bats. So you're not going to eradicate SARS-CoV-2. So from strike one, it's just not possible.
Absolutely. And I mean, many of the organizations that we've mentioned, like the WHO and so on, have said that it's going to become endemic. I believe Nature magazine just recently, they did a survey of scientists in the area of medicine, and something like 90% of them out of the whatever 1,000 or so that were sampled said they believe COVID-19 is going to become an endemic part of human life, like the flu, like any of these other diseases that we just have to essentially live with, which is what most people have been saying from the beginning, you know?
The argument they use, I think they're using, is mutations and variations and strains. Now, they're not all necessarily, they aren't actually the same thing. But that argument is actually null and void. It doesn't carry any weight. That is not a reason at all. And referencing other countries is another problem. And of course, the standouts are Australia and New Zealand. And if you wanted to start off way back when, before there's a couple of cases in the country, it might work. But you ask New Zealand and Australia how they're doing, like they might be doing okay in terms of cases and numbers, but economically and lots of other ways, they're not doing that well at all. So I don't think it was ever an option for Ireland. By the time we woke up to the reality of the situation, it was almost endemic in the country.
Absolutely. Obviously, speaking of masks and mask mandates and things like that, in America, I'm sure you know that many US states, including Texas and others, have completely lifted the mask mandates and, in fact, almost all COVID restrictions by law, and that cases, not only have they not seen a big increase, but they've actually slumped in many cases. I'm wondering if you'd want to talk about that a little bit and what you think is going on there.
This comes back to the science bent. Like the only science that is really there is ignored, absolutely ignored or denied. And you mentioned Texas. I think the standout one really is in the States is Florida. And there, as you've said, there are at least 20 others like South Dakota who have said enough of this. And as you've said, not alone have their numbers not got worse, they've actually improved to the same or even greater degree than the countries the states that have implemented or retained rolling lockdowns as we have. But I go back to, like, why can't we stay closer to home? The perfect scientific study has been done inadvertently in Ireland and Sweden. We've done the study. We've compared the management of 10 million people versus 5 million people with two entirely different processes. The outcome in terms of deaths, which seems to be people's only metric for measuring the effects of this, is that we in fact have done worse than Sweden. So there's the science. So case proven. Let's get rid of lockdowns here and now.
Absolutely.
Right.
So to play devil's advocate then, what would you say to somebody watching this video who says, but sure, if we don't continue the lockdown, or at least ease it on a very phased, gradual basis, which is what NEFIT and all these different groups are saying, surely the health system will be overwhelmed by a fourth wave or a fifth wave or whatever we're on now. It's hard to even keep track. And our whole health service will be completely decimated, because that was, of course, the reason for the initial lockdown, 6 weeks to stop the spread and flatten the curve and all this kind of thing. And here we are. That's been a long 6 weeks. But what would you think of that argument?
There are numerous ways to approach that, and I'm sorry I made it so broad. Can I start by saying, if somebody asked me last June how could I maximise the impact on the health service, and how would I overwhelm the health service in December and January, I would have said to do exactly what NEFA did. Keep the thing completely locked down or semi-locked down all during the summer. Don't allow anybody to develop immunity, and keep it rumbling right through the autumn, and then 2 weeks before Christmas, release the floodgates. Now, the people who did that obviously have no idea what goes on in the health service. Every last 2 weeks in the year and every January, our ICUs are full to the brim. Our hospitals are overflowing. In this winter before 1920, there were 700 people on Monday on trolleys. 700 people on trolleys before ever COVID round. So that gives us some idea of how busy the system was before ever COVID came along. So if you wanted to overwhelm that system, then you release the floodgates and let it rip through the community, as people say. And that's what we did. Like, I actually anticipated a far, far worse December and January just gone than actually happened. I was amazed we got away as lightly as we did, because what they did was a recipe for disaster.
And of course, the virus is seasonal, as are most respiratory illnesses, which is well established. And so, I mean, the government are talking about easing the restrictions over the summer. And no doubt, as is the way with politicians, they're going to take credit for suddenly this, I would imagine, a great drop in case numbers and so on. And they're saying, look at the terrific success of our policy. And yet, both Micheál Martin last night on Virgin Media, he was speaking and he said that he can't rule out another lockdown this winter, again, even despite the vaccine rollout. And UK's scientists who are working for the government have said that they would expect another wave in kind of autumn, towards the winter, that kind of time period. So people are just completely ignoring the seasonality of the virus, and they're going to act like, oh, summer, the lockdown has worked, and then winter, oh, it's because we didn't lock down for long enough and we need to lock down again. It's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Almost, and well, I'm going to go back. I'm sorry, Ben. I'm going to go back to Sweden, because
of course,
I've just told you the Sweden system works, and that is controlled. Okay, controlled restrictions. If there's an outbreak in a city or in an area, you ask people, let's take care here. Let's be a bit more sensible. Let's mind the vulnerable, which is where I started over a year ago. Let's protect the at risk. And undoubtedly there will be, and undoubtedly there will be more outbreaks, if you like. There'll be more death. People seem to forget that some of these experts 1 year ago were predicting up to 120,000 deaths. Now, what modelling they were using, I have no idea. The worst possible scenario in terms of deaths you could arrive at, once you looked at the age fatality properties of the disease, you'd realise there couldn't be deaths in anywhere remotely close to that. I estimated that to be about 9,000 deaths. And there will be more deaths with COVID before it's finished. There is one other thing in relation to that. Like, I've heard NEFID spokespeople talk about if 5% of the people have had the condition are immune. Like, that's utterly ridiculous. If you use John Ioannidis' calculation, he said 0.23, and he's actually revised that down now to even less than 2. And if you use the Irish mortality rate and use it at 0.2%, you actually come up with the sum that 2,500 Irish people have already been in contact and had this disease. So we're over halfway there. And that's ignoring a far more important or equally important factor, and that is that estimates of who is already immune to a degree because of other COVID exposure or other COVID virus exposure is between 20 and 50%. So I would estimate that we're 66% there, and we will have minor fluctuations and minor outbreaks, but they can be controlled without any lockdowns.
Well, I've heard people talking about the natural immunity that you get, of course, when you get the virus and that you have antibodies in your system. Most people's immune system can handle this. What is it? I think 99.7% survival rate or something thereabouts. And so when they're talking about things like vaccine passports for traveling and that you need to make sure you've been vaccinated before you can go or do anything, I've heard people say, if anything, if we're going to implement something like that, which I personally would think is a bad idea, but if we were going to do it, surely it should be an immunity passport where you just prove you're immune either via the vaccine or saying, I had COVID last week and I've gotten over it, and so I'm just as safe as if I had taken the Pfizer jab or I'd taken the AstraZeneca jab. And I mean, it seems like they're massively overemphasizing the vaccine as the only possible way of solving this problem when there's many natural ways that you could go about it.
Ben, by engaging in that kind of argument, you're almost accepting that vaccine passport is a sensible way to go, or looking for immunity in every individual before you allow them to cross a border. To me, that's nonsensical. It's madness, utter madness. And if you want to get dragged or drag me into the vaccine debate, I'm quite happy to do that. But vaccine passports for a condition that's, as you've said, 99.7+% survival rate, that's endemic across the entire world virtually at this stage, is ridiculous. If places like New Zealand, Australia want to remain COVID-free for the rest of eternity, or as long as the earth survives, that's their problem. Like, it's not my job to look after New Zealand and Australia, but if they want to introduce that, but the rest of the world has COVID, it's endemic to the same degree. The immunity, as you've said, is there's a community immunity, and there will be, and you'll have minor outbreaks as things go on. The place of vaccine is to be debated. There's no doubt there's a place for vaccine. I'm not anti-vaccine, but I am absolutely against giving an experimental vaccine that is fast-tracked, untried, to young, healthy people. I think it's beyond irresponsible. It's at least reckless, and to recommend it for school children is untenable. It's just unthinkable.
I mean, apart from the safety issues, and obviously we've seen now blood clotting fears, admittedly rare, but still fears nonetheless, among the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and so on. It makes you wonder, if you're a young person, as you say, a school child or an 18-year-old athlete, what is the risk that that person's going to die of COVID versus the risk that they're going to get some side effect? And it's so untried and untested by definition. These are new vaccines, we've just had them, that it's hard to tell what the possible long-term side effects could be, or I mean, who knows, potentially. So as you say, it's not about being anti-vax necessarily. It's about a risk assessment and weighing up, well, is it really worth a chance when I could probably take my chances with the virus itself and be totally fine?
There are, this is the third time in history that we've used, or have been used, fast-track vaccines. The first was 1976 that very few people know about, that cost the American exchequer an awful lot of money and did no good whatsoever. But the most important one is 2009, and I'm very familiar and aware with that, for the swine flu. Mm-hmm. And a week after the German chief medical officer equivalent said, we're not using that in Germany, we introduced it here for a condition that was virtually gone and for a pandemic that actually never materialized. And the HSE itself admits that 35 people before the courts with narcolepsy was a proven complication of that vaccine. The real number is probably in the order of 80 to 100. Now, they were 4 to 19 years of age. They have narcolepsy and their lives are ruined. They can't drive a car, can't hold down a lot of jobs. So their risk from the disease was much less than that. Reckon 1 in 12,000 people got that. And the Irish government was the only one that fought it in the courts. England, Norway and Canada, I think, didn't. They just said, we're compensating these people for this. We're not going to fight it in the courts. And Ireland decided to fight it in the courts and obviously gave up halfway through. So I'm acutely aware of that. Now, some of those complications, going back to your point, developed up to 11 months after the vaccine. The mean was 2 months. These vaccines, most of them got tried out to 3 months before they were unleashed without going through final phase testing. And we now see the results of that. We see this clotting, which would have shown up and probably would have prevented it from being licensed. But yet we're happy to give this to our children and our young people. So back to the most basic tenet of medicine, the risk for these people getting the vaccine is greater than the benefit they could possibly gain from getting it. So in medicine, that's called negligence.
And in terms of, coercing somebody to take a vaccine, which is essentially what the vaccine passports and all these related restrictions are, talked about having more freedoms for people who are vaccinated and almost creating a two-tier society where you're a second-class citizen unless you want to inject biological materials into your bloodstream. And, you think about, first of all, it seems like a violation of human rights. And second of all, if somebody is vaccinated, let's say this person's deathly afraid of COVID-19 and they're seriously concerned about it, keeps them up at night. If they're vaccinated, how can you or I not being vaccinated possibly affect them or their safety? You would have thought that it should be a choice thing where you say, take it if you're that worried about it, and everybody else, if you want to take your chances, it's your prerogative, it's your personal responsibility to worry about your own health. It's not the job of the state to make you immune. I don't know, it just seems like a very strange sort of Orwellian nanny state situation.
Well, it is that anyway, and we're getting there, and that's a worry for everybody, but it goes back to mixing up and confusing all kinds of science and all kinds of common sense, because in this situation, they're not reconcilable. On the one hand, your vaccine is effective or it's not effective. And if it's not effective, why get it in the first place? If it is effective, why does someone else need to get it? Mm-hmm. And you'd leave it at that, yes?
Absolutely.
But that's not the way we're thinking.
Pfizer, the CEO of Pfizer, has just come out and he said that there may be a third vaccine required, a third dose after you've been so-called fully vaccinated with the first 2 jabs, and that might be needed as soon as 6 months after. And that they're saying then, I think the US Biden administration were talking about having an annual booster jab because they believe the vaccine's effectiveness will wear off over time, and that I even heard Biden's health expert saying that the new variants will cause the vaccine to have to work harder to try and provide immunity to the person. I'm not a medical expert, I don't know anything about this subject, so I'm wondering, while I have you in the studio, do you see any scientific merit to that argument or that statement?
Scientific, no. It goes back to risk-benefit. How dangerous is this disease? And what's missed, this is going way back now, Ben, but what's missed and not alluded to all the time is the stark reality that we can identify with such accuracy who's at risk from this disease and how it differs from others. And the 2 most crucial ones, that it affects the elderly to a greater degree than other members of the population isn't a surprise. That's true of influenza, that's true of most of these illnesses. What is so different is that children are not, or minimally affected by this. And the second most important part is that children do not transmit this to any detectable degree. Like, that's hugely different to anything else. In fact, it's very, very different to the regular influenza, which is transmitted mostly by children, people think. And that will drag you into the school debate, which again is a debate that makes no sense. But in one part of me sympathises with teachers, because effectively the population has been terrorised. Call it brainwashed if you will, but they've been terrorised. So you spend countless millions terrorising with a propaganda campaign, and then you get annoyed because they're not de-terrorised in a few minutes and go back and walk into school and start teaching. And I understand that. But that's the reason we're in this dilemma we're in at the moment. But that we should... There are two things that are really annoying. The idea that someone should be promoting vaccines with a form of gene therapy, untried, unproven, risks unknown, to children who are at zero risk. To me, that's bordering on criminal. To recommend something for a section of the population that is dangerous to them, for them to protect the elderly, I'm not sure if that's ethically acceptable or morally acceptable. Personally, I don't think it is. From my point of view, I'm 70 years of age. I certainly do not want any 20-year-old getting a vaccine to protect me. And if they did, and something happened to them, I would feel bloody bad.
What do you think of the zero COVID movement in Ireland and how it's been treated by the media? Because obviously we've seen these groups, ISAG, the Independent Scientific Advisory Group, they are trotted out on the media quite a bit, it seems, and Professor Anthony Staines and all these individuals, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Gript leaks that we did as to that organisation and its modus operandi. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that whole school of thought and the practicality of what they're proposing?
Well, I think we've dealt with the zero COVID philosophy or agenda, and as I've said, to me, it's scientifically, it's based on what we know, it's not possible. So therefore, it's defunct. The people who are accepted as being experts and spend their times on the airwaves and no one else can get at the airwaves, and some of the statements they make are border on credibility. And again, it comes back to the point I was making about the surprise that people accept these people and accept what they say as gospel, despite the fact that over and over and over they've been proven wrong. Not alone in part of their pronouncements as to the number of deaths that were going to happen. The lowest they had was 80,000 and the highest was 120, I think, which is way off the scale and was never credible, really. So these people, to me, don't have any credibility. And the whole policy is untenable, it's unscientific and unachievable.
To what extent would you say that personal people's reputations plays a role in all of this? Because, I mean, obviously, if you're a scientist, as we've discussed already, you're a human being. So if a group like NEFID or one of these organizations says, listen, we need to lock down the whole country, we need to take all these restrictive measures, and then the end result is the economy lies in ruins, hundreds of thousands of people's livelihoods have been permanently destroyed. I think the Restaurant Association of Ireland just recently said that half of all pubs and restaurants are facing permanent closure. They'll never open again. And so you've basically brought rack and ruin on the country. And then at the end, somebody like yourself comes along and seems to show actually probably a lot of these measures weren't necessary at all. That would be a bitter pill to swallow for anybody. You know, what normal person would want to put their hand up and say, oh yeah, actually, sorry, I made a mistake and I ruined everyone's life for no reason at all. To what degree do you think that people's personal egos and reputations plays a role in all of this?
It's hard to know. It's a very difficult question because it is possible that some of these commentators, expert or otherwise, believe absolutely in what they're saying, and I think there is a degree of that. Yeah, and that's fair enough. What's missing, as we've said repeatedly during this talk, is that unfortunately anyone with a contrary opinion or mindset is not allowed to express it. So there's one part of the problem. There is no doubt that when people get a high profile, that it impacts on their thinking, and as you said, the last thing you want is to be undermined or to be discredited. So it's a very tough place to be. But I'm afraid once you start putting yourself out there, that's part and parcel of the game, isn't it? But the worry is that, again, none of the commentators who have opinions that don't fit the NEFIT agenda completely or gospel have no access to the public to say what they think. We do have a major problem in that the public has been terrorised, brainwashed effectively, very effectively, and that seems to be impossible to turn around. And at the moment our government leaders seem to be led by polls or opinion polls, and so the people say, well, we need to bring in quarantine, or we need more lockdowns. So they go with that. I mean, in one sense, it's the perfect democracy. The leaders are doing what the people are telling them, but it forgets the part that the people have been preliminary, early brainwashed and terrorised. So what else are they going to say?
Absolutely.
It's we're in a no-win situation here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Feeley. Really appreciate your time.